There was a really famous moment on British TV back in 1995. It was on the Mrs. Merton show. Don't know if any of you remember that. In case you don't remember that or no idea what that was, it was a comedy talk show. And basically the woman who created it was Caroline Aherne, I think wasn't that her name. She played the main character of the programme, who was this older woman called Mrs. Merton. So she would dress up, she had big glasses, huge big glasses, she had a silver perm, she dressed like an old woman, and then Mrs. Merton, she would have these different celebrity guests on each week, and in the guise of this old lady, she would interview the guests. And one week, the most famous moment that this show ever had, the guest was a lady called Debbie McGee. And Debbie McGee was 26 years old at the time, so a young woman, and she was married to Paul Daniels. Paul Daniels, at that stage, was getting towards 50. And the very first question that Mrs. Merton asked was this: what first attracted you to the millionaire Paul Daniels? And that line, it's gone down in TV history. It's still famous even today, because on the surface, it's a genuine question. But it's a question that has a fair bit of needle. Mrs. Merton doesn't actually want the answer to the question. She's trying to make a point. Now, in fairness, it's a question that was played for laughs. Debbie McGee laughed along with it. There was no nastiness involved. But that's not always the case. And I wonder, have any of you maybe ever heard someone asking a question and it's not really a question? Maybe a question that's actually designed to show somebody up. It's designed to make them look bad. Maybe a question that is designed to put someone into a really difficult position. Because if they don't answer the question, then it looks like they're hiding something. But if they do answer the question, well, there's no easy way of kind of getting out of the quandary. It's a difficult spot to be in. Well, this evening we are looking at a question that is just like that. And it's a question that's aimed at Jesus. And it's not a question that those asking want an answer for. They simply want to make Jesus look as bad as they possibly can. And yet, what we're going to see this evening is something we saw last week, something we're going to keep on seeing in Mark's Gospel. Jesus turns the tables. Jesus isn't perturbed by these questions. Jesus isn't stumped by them. He turns the tables. He changes everything. Now, we see the question in verse 18. Now, John's disciples, so John, by the way, is John the Baptist, who we spent a bit of time thinking about in chapter 1. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? As one writer puts it, there is a league table for spirituality, and Jesus is languishing in third place. There's an unspoken question, I think, that lies behind the question that is actually asked. And the unspoken question is, well, if Jesus isn't teaching his disciples to fast, what other things is Jesus not teaching his disciples to do? So it's a question that is going to be really hard for Jesus to answer. Whatever way he answers this question, you think surely it's going to seem that Jesus just isn't as spiritual as these other guys. And so how is Jesus going to answer? Well, we're going to see in this passage, Jesus doesn't actually answer the question head on. In some ways, he doesn't give a terribly straight answer to the question. Instead, what Jesus does do is he gives some fairly cryptic pictures in response. And so I want us to look at Jesus' answer. And this evening, I want us to learn two lessons from this response that Jesus gives. And so here's the first lesson. You can't have an empty plate at a wedding. You can't have an empty plate at a wedding. Give you a moment to write that down. That's a longer point than we normally have. You can imagine, Jesus, why are you not telling your disciples to fast? Well, verse 19. Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. Or to put it another way, imagine you get invited to a wedding. And imagine the bride's parents have paid an absolute fortune and the reception is at Harvey's Point. And there's canapes, there is mouth-watering, slow-roasted lamb, there's fresh rosemary, fresh garlic, there is the most exquisite creme brulee that money can possibly buy. And imagine that you sit there throughout the meal, a big frown on your face, and an empty plate. What do the bride's parents think whenever they see you? I mean, do they think to themselves, well, that's great, that's so commendable, he's so much self-discipline, working on his diet like that, we've just got to admire it. Well, they don't. They feel insulted. If you don't get stuck in, they feel insulted, the chef feels insulted, and they feel like you have insulted their daughter as well. Or to put it another way, a wedding is for feasting. It's not for fasting. Of course, there is actually a place for fasting. There's a restaurant in Belfast I've been to a few times. It's called Cosmo. It is an all-you-can-eat buffet, and it's an incredible place. It has got just about every sort of food that you can possibly imagine. There's Chinese, there's Indian, there's pizza. There's actually live cooking sessions where you can watch the chef cooking your steak as you sit there. It's brilliant. And the best thing about Cosmo is as soon as you finish your plate, you can go straight back up, you can get another plate, and you can fill it up all over again. And I've not been there for a while, but whenever I do go to Cosmo, what I do is I tend to starve myself for most of the day. So I don't eat any lunch. I try and make sure I'm as hungry as I can possibly be so I can fit in as much food as I possibly can. I want to get my money's worth. You could say in one sense, I'm fasting because I'm waiting for the feast. And that actually is where John's disciples are getting things wrong. You see, John's disciples were waiting for the feast. John had been telling his disciples that the Messiah was on his way. Or to put it another way, to use Jesus' language here, John was telling the disciples that the groom was going to come. And these men knew that whenever the Messiah came, he would put everything right. They knew that whenever the Messiah came, he would bring God's plan of salvation to fulfillment. They knew it was going to be a wonderful thing. It was going to be worthy of celebration. And yet, they missed something very important. The Messiah is already here. That means that John's disciples, they were like someone sitting in Cosmo, ignoring the steaming hot trays, ignoring the fragrant smells, and just sitting there with empty plates. If you're in Cosmo, it's not the time to just sit there. It's the time to fill up. And John's disciples didn't grasp this. That's John's disciples, but what's the application for us? Well, the application for us is that we are to remember that the groom is already here. We're to remember that the Messiah has already conquered sin. He has already crushed the serpent's head. We're to remember that the Messiah has washed away those stubborn stains of our guilt. We're to remember that he has clothed us with his perfect righteousness. We're to remember that the Messiah has won for us the most glorious inheritance it's possible to imagine. We're to remember that he has guaranteed for us the most incredible everlasting life. We're to remember that he has reconciled us to the one who's made us. We're to remember that he has brought us into God's family so we can call God our Father. We're to remember that Jesus has arrived. But more than that, we're to remember not only that Jesus has arrived, but we're to remember that Jesus is here. And he's still here. We're to remember that Jesus, the groom, the bridegroom, he is with us right now through the ministry of his Holy Spirit. And surely that means we're to rejoice. Surely that means that we are to sing the psalms of Jesus with gladness. Surely that means that we're to share the good news of Jesus with excitement. And surely it means the way in which we respond to the circumstances of life is to change. The groom has arrived. He's here. Changes how we respond when we lose something, doesn't it? Changes how we respond when the plans we make don't quite work out. Because we realise, whatever I've lost, I have something far, far better because the groom, the Lord Jesus, is with me. Jesus being here changes how we respond whenever hard things happen. Because hard things do still happen to Christians. Christians still weep. Christians still mourn. Christians still have tears. And yet mingled with our tears, there's a joy, isn't there, that goes down deeper. The fact that Jesus is here, it changes how we respond to hard things. As well as that, it changes how we respond to good things. It infuses the good things of life, the blessings of life, with even greater vibrancy, because every single blessing that we get to enjoy in this life is like an appetizer that helps us to appreciate the infinitely glorious blessings that we have in Jesus. The groom has arrived. The groom is with us. And so let me say to you this evening, if you're not yet a Christian, whenever you come to church, it's a bit like coming to a 5-star restaurant. You can smell the aromas coming from the kitchen. You can see the mouth-watering dishes that other people are tucking into. But if you're not yet a Christian, you're sitting there with an empty plate. And all I want to say to you this evening, if you're not yet a Christian, is get stuck in. You don't need to get ready to get stuck in. You don't need to get yourself right before you stuck in. You don't need to sort your life out beforehand. The food is right there. And so the time has come to feast. If you are a Christian, what I want to say to you this evening is savour it. Savour the joy. Savour the flavours. Breathe in the rich aromas of the feast and delight in what you have in Jesus. First lesson from this passage. You can't have an empty plate at a wedding. Second lesson. Jesus doesn't fit on a side plate. Jesus doesn't fit on a side plate. So I thought about John's disciples. They are fasting because they're waiting for the Messiah to come. What about the Pharisees? Why are they fasting? Well, they're actually fasting for a different reason from John's disciples. One of the things that you may know about the Pharisees, we tend to mention this every time they appear in the story. One of the things you may know is that the Pharisees absolutely loved to take the laws that God had given in the Old Testament and then to push them as far as they possibly could. They liked to go even further than God had. In fact, they liked to go much further than God had with their different rules. And that allowed the Pharisees to sort of sit there very smugly and to say, what a good boy am I. In the Old Testament, God had set aside one day all year when he expected his people to fast. Only one day. There were other fasts responding to other circumstances, but there was only one regular day of fasting in the whole year. That was the Day of Atonement. But the Pharisees took it a whole lot further. And the Pharisees, they didn't simply fast once a year. They fasted twice. Not twice a year, though. Twice a week. Mondays and Thursdays were fast days. And so it's hardly a big surprise in this passage that the Pharisees are really, really smug. Because they're fasting, 105 days in a year. And they see Jesus' disciples, and Jesus' disciples aren't even bothering at all. And so they try to trap Jesus with this question. Jesus, why do you not teach your disciples to fast? And you can imagine the Pharisees. They think they're going to come out of this smelling like roses. But they don't. Because yet again, Jesus turns the tables. And he does that by giving two pictures from everyday life. Verse 21, first of all. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. Getting towards the end of September, any of you young people at school worn out your trousers yet? Maybe playing football in the playground, maybe you've been sliding around and you end up wearing out your knee. You imagine that happens, and imagine maybe your mum reaches into that bag of material that for some reason mums have, and she picks out a brand new piece. She makes sure, she holds it up against the trousers, she makes sure that it matches the colour, and then she sews it on, and that is the job done. Until you put the trousers in the wash. And whenever you do that, this new piece of cloth, it maybe shrinks in the wash because it's never been washed before. And as it shrinks in the wash, it pulls in the stitches and it makes the hole worse, and the trousers are far, far worse than they were at the start. Well, that's the picture that Jesus is giving us in verse 21. And then we get the second picture in verse 22. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into old wineskins. So to understand this picture, you need to know a little bit about everyday life. 2,000 years ago, typically speaking, people did not keep wine in glass bottles. If you've ever watched maybe movies set in Roman times, you've maybe seen this. They didn't use glass bottles. Instead, they had animal skins. And they would sew these animal skins up to make a bit of a flask. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is, these animal skins would start out very soft and very flexible. But over time, they would go hard and they'd go brittle. You think of it a bit like a poppadom. And if you handle a poppadom too roughly, it just sort of breaks into pieces. A hard, brittle wineskin is okay for old wine, but it's no use whatsoever for new wine, because new wine is still fermenting, and as it ferments, it lets off gases. So I don't know if any of you here have ever got into making sourdough. And if you've got into making sourdough, you've had a sourdough starter and you've put it into a glass jar. And so you've been able to see what's been going on day by day. And you'll know that as the days go by, you get more and more bubbles and it starts to swell up because the sourdough starter is still fermenting. Well, you imagine the mess you would have in your hands if you didn't keep your sourdough starter in a glass jar, but you kept it in a really brittle container. It would be a disaster. Not something that the people in Jesus' day would have known very well. So what's Jesus saying here? It's very simple, actually. Jesus is saying that new cloth is incompatible with old clothes. He's saying that new wine is incompatible with old wineskins. And in the same way, he's saying that he is incompatible with the old ways. Jesus is telling us here that his coming into the world is the moment in time when the old era passes away and the new era arrives. Now, look, I'm not saying this evening, we're not going to go into this, I'm not saying that there is never any reason to fast. And there can be good reasons to fast nowadays. But what Jesus is saying here, and what the rest of the New Testament teaches us, is that now that Jesus has come, there is no need for the various ceremonial laws that we see in the Old Testament. So you think about all the different laws we have in the book of Leviticus, for example, the ones that are related to ceremonies, so laws about the temple, laws about the priests, laws about animal sacrifices. You think of the laws about clean food and unclean food and leprosy and all these various laws. You think actually the sorts of laws that non-Christians sometimes love to throw in our faces. And they say, well, if you believe the Bible so much, tell me this, how come you still eat pork? And they ask it as if we've never ever thought of that question before. But Jesus is hinting here at something that the rest of the New Testament makes absolutely explicit. These ceremonial laws, not the moral laws, not the Ten Commandments, but the ceremonial laws, they were simply designed to get people ready for his coming. And that's their sole purpose. You could keep all of these laws religiously, and they wouldn't be able to absolve you of even one single sin. They're like signposts. They're showing you the direction that you're travelling. But you don't need a signpost when you've reached your destination. And now Jesus has arrived. He is the destination, and that means we can put the signs behind us. The problem is, though, the Pharisees didn't like that. They liked the old wineskins. They loved the signs. They loved the ceremonial laws. They loved to push those laws to their limits. They loved the idea that they could somehow tick all of the right boxes and it would make things right. So Jesus says here, I am completely incompatible with that way of thinking. That is like pouring new wine into old wineskins. If you try to have both, you'll end up with neither. Or if we can change the picture slightly, these guys don't treat Jesus as the main meal. They thought he was a side dish. A bit like when you go out and you order a lovely, juicy sirloin. You might order crispy onions. You might order garlic fries. You might order pepper sauce. But that's how people saw Jesus. He's just another option to have on the side. You can take him or you can leave him. The tragedy, of course, is that is how many people today see Jesus. He's a side dish. Maybe even for some, he's just a garnish. That's all he is. For some people, it's because they want to live their lives their way. They want to keep the same priorities they've always had. They want to do the same things they've always done. And the last thing they want is Jesus coming and making all of his demands. And so they decide, well, it's okay, I can live my life the way I've always lived my life, and I can have a wee bit of Jesus on the side. And Jesus says, doesn't work like that. Even some really religious people can think in the same way. There are some people in churches, and they just will not let go of the notion that they can somehow be good enough to earn their salvation. And yes, I mean, if you ask them, they'll say, of course, it comes down to the grace of Jesus. I'll never be good enough to do it. It's all about Jesus. They don't actually mean that. And their way of life shows that they don't actually mean that. Jesus is just the garnish. He just rests on top of their good works. And Jesus says here, that doesn't work. You can't fit Jesus on a side date. So let me urge you. Put Jesus right at the very centre. Put him at the centre of your hopes for forgiveness, for salvation. And don't let anything get in Jesus' way. Don't allow coming to church to get in Jesus' way. Don't allow your witnessing to get in Jesus' way. Don't allow your good theology to push Jesus to the side. Put him right in the very centre. We need to put him at the very centre, not just of our hopes for salvation, but of our whole lives as well. Is there anything in your life that is in danger of pushing Jesus onto a side date? Is there anything in your life that is taking up too much space? Your hobbies, your job, your relationship. Don't let anything push Jesus to the side. And when we grasp just how amazing Jesus is, when we grasp the joy that we can have because the Christ, the Messiah, has now arrived, and when we grasp that Jesus doesn't fit in a side plate, but he is more than enough to satisfy us 100 times over, well, it changes everything, doesn't it? And whenever we put the Lord Jesus in his proper place, unlike John's disciples, unlike the Pharisees, but like the disciples of Jesus, we get to feast like no one has ever feasted before. So there's the lesson of this passage. The Christ has come, the bridegroom is here, the food is piled high, and now's the time to tuck in.